It was now September 1910, a year after the downfall of Sultan Abdul Hamid and the formal entombment of the remains of the Bab on Mount Carmel. And after 6 decades of exile and imprisonment, the time had come for Abdul-Baha to consecrate his remaining strength on a historic journey to the West, first to Egypt, then to Europe, and finally to America. Although he had to postpone his departure from Egypt owing to illness, by August 1911 he'd embarked for Marseille, and from there he continued on to Thonon-les-Bains on the shores of Lac Léman before proceeding to London.
Sarah Louisa Blomfield, an early member of the Baha'i faith in England, offered her home as his residence, and here the master met people from all walks of life. Among them was Reverend John Campbell, who invited the master to give his first ever public talk to the congregation at the City Temple on September the 10th, 1911. Few of the 2,000-strong congregation present would forget the sight of the venerable figure, clad in Eastern garb, ascending the pulpit stairs to address a gathering. Reverend Campbell introduced him. "We, as the followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is to us and will always be the light of the world, view with sympathy and respect every movement of the Spirit of God in the experience of mankind. And therefore we give greeting to Abdul-Baha in the name of all who share the spirit of our Master and are trying to live their lives in that spirit." Then Abdul-Baha stepped into the pulpit and spoke in Persian. "O noble friends, seekers after God, the gift of God to this enlightened age is the knowledge of the oneness of mankind and of the fundamental oneness of religion. Praise be to God, in this country the standard of justice has been raised." A week later, he delivered a talk at St. John the Divine, where he had been invited by the Archdeacon Wilberforce. This distinguished gentleman was a grandson of the famed abolitionist William Wilberforce, who had been instrumental in ending slavery in 1833, an Act of Parliament which won the praise of Bahá'u'lláh in his tablet to Queen Victoria. To see these two men walking hand in hand all the way down the aisle in this historic building was, according to Lady Blomfield, an unforgettable sight. Abdul-Baha's beautiful voice reverberated through the sanctuary, and the translation of his words were read aloud by the Archdeacon. "Truly, the East and West have met in this sacred place tonight." As they both passed back down the aisle together towards the vestry, the hymn, "O God, our help in ages past," was sung by the entire congregation. Abdul-Baha's first visit to London soon drew to a close, and he left for Paris, where the first French believer, Monsieur Hippolyte Dreyfus, had prepared an apartment for him. Situated in the Avenue de Camoins, it was sunny and spacious, and had been charmingly furnished by Laura Barney. The Eiffel Tower stood within view, and a flight of steps nearby led into the Trocadero Gardens, where the master often took solitary, restful walks. The seeds of the very first Baha'i community in Europe had been planted in the French capital in 1898 by May Bowles, one of the early American pilgrims, to visit the master. Now, a decade later, the Baha'i community in the City of Light was well established, and there were many requests for meetings with the master.
Lady Blomfield and her daughters had followed Abdul-Baha to Paris. Together with another Baha'i, they kept careful notes of his talks during those memorable days. The master was very pleased with Paris Talks and encouraged its early publication. After his European tour, the Master returned to Ramleh in Egypt for the winter, but the American believers longed for him to visit there too. They sent him thousands of dollars to travel in comfort across the Atlantic on the maiden voyage of the RMS Titanic. But he returned the money, saying that it should be used for charity, and embarked instead on the RMS Cedric on the 25th of March 1912, sailing via Naples to New York. Later, in the course of his American journey, news of the sinking of the Titanic reached him, and he spoke about it at the Washington home of the Hannans on April the 23rd. Abdu'l-Bahá described the drowning of so many souls as a disaster, a terrible event, an event saddening to every heart and grieving every spirit. He recalled the many passengers of the Titanic who had voyaged on the Cedric with him as far as Naples, and who had chosen to continue to New York on this famed ship. But although he mourned that so many of our fellow human beings were drowned and had passed beyond this earthly life, he concluded, "When I consider this calamity in another aspect, I am consoled by the realization that the worlds of God are infinite, that though they were deprived of this existence, they have other opportunities in the life beyond, even as Christ had said, 'In my Father's house are many mansions.'" Mirza Mahmud Zargani, who accompanied the Master, kept a careful record of all that happened over the course of this 17-day voyage. One day, for example, Abdu'l-Bahá was invited to give a talk in the largest hall to more than 1,500 curious fellow travelers on the ship. Among them were many children on whom he showered his love. On Thursday, the 11th of April, the steamer finally approached the shores of America. As the Master was breakfasting, dozens of telegrams addressed to him were delivered to the dining room. They were from all the Baha'i assemblies, expressing great joy on his imminent arrival. The approach to New York was impressive. There stood the majestic Statue of Liberty in mid-water. And there was the city emerging through the mist at last with its iconic tall buildings. As the ship drew near the quay, two enormous skyscrapers, 45 and 35 stories high, loomed into view. The Master referred to them humorously as the minarets of the West. Many Baha'i friends from New York and the surrounding areas were waiting in line on the jetty, waving their hats and handkerchiefs in excitement. The Master, however, could not yet disembark, as newspaper reporters had already scrambled on board to interview him. He sent a message to the anxious friends that he would meet them later that day at the home of Edward and Carrie Kinney. In reply to the reporters' queries about his visit, Abdu'l-Bahá said, "Our object is universal peace and the unity of humankind. I have traveled to Paris and London, and now I have come to America to meet with those who seek universal peace, and I hope that the peace societies of America will take the lead in promoting this end." When they asked him how this peace could be achieved, Abdu'l-Bahá answered, "Its realization is through the attraction and support of world public opinion. Today, universal peace is the panacea for all human life." When asked if he were a prophet, Abdu'l-Bahá corrected them. "I am not a prophet," he said. "I am a servant of God. My name is Abdu'l-Bahá, the servant of Bahá'í." Despite this, throughout his 239 days' stay in this vast country, the newspapers repeatedly referred to the Master as the Prophet of God and the Messenger of Peace.
His stay was extended far longer than initially planned. He visited communities from the East Coast to the Midwest, delivering talks to large audiences in churches, synagogues, societies, and also in individuals' homes, all along his train journey to California. The Master's first public talk took place on Sunday, April the 14th, at the Church of the Ascension on Fifth Avenue. It was a historic day for the Baha'is of New York City, especially Juliet Thompson, a parishioner of this church where the rector had at one time fiercely denounced Abdu'l-Bahá. Instead of the traditional lesson for the day, the service opened with a reading of Corinthians chapter 13 and the prophecies about the return of Christ. Abdu'l-Bahá was waiting in the vestry. When the organ music began to thunder and the triumphant words, "Jesus lives," rang out, he walked up the nave with kingly strides. Dr. Percy Grant, the church rector, led him by the hand all the way up to the bishop's chair. Before a throng of 2,000, Dr. Grant introduced the master with the greatest respect, concluding with an emotional request that Abdu'l-Bahá give the benediction. With his face uplifted, his eyes closed, and his palms raised in supplication, Abdu'l-Bahá chanted a prayer in Persian, with the clergyman leaning on each side of him. It was, according to Juliet, too great to be put into words. It was almost too great to bear. After the service, the master went out to his car in the company of the believers, while the whole neighbourhood resounded with the cries of Allahu Akbar. There were certain extraordinary events which took place over the course of the master's journeys across America and Canada, which, in retrospect, seem to have acquired an even greater relevance not only for the United States, but for the whole world. One concerned the issue of racial unity. Abdu'l-Bahá was very forthright on this subject. He considered it the most pressing issue and most important challenge facing America, and his words had a direct impact on individuals. A young Englishwoman in the group, Louisa Matthews, had met a black American lawyer called Lewis Gregory during her visit to Abdu'l-Bahá in Egypt. It was now the master's ardent hope that these two should be wed, and his hope was fulfilled when their wedding took place in New York City soon after his arrival that September. Their union at such a time and in such a segregated nation was a powerful symbol of racial harmony and demonstrated publicly the Bahá'í principle in this regard. The master relished mixed gatherings of black and white people, as can be heard from his remarks delivered at Howard University in Washington, D.C. on the 23rd of April. "Today I am most happy, for I see here a gathering of the servants of God. I see white and black sitting together. There are no whites and blacks before God. All colours are one, and that is the colour of servitude to God." His encouragement led to the Race Amity Conference hosted by the Baha'is of Washington, D.C., which took place in May 1921, and where a message from the Master was read aloud.
Furthermore, his words were put into action at a prestigious gathering while in the nation's capital, and this led to his being featured as one of the Men of the Month in an issue of The Crisis, a publication of the NAACP. Howard University still commemorates his visit in annual events on its campus. According to the newspapers, ex-President Theodore Roosevelt was apparently wonderfully impressed with the teachings of Abdu'l-Bahá, the Persian teacher of a universal religion liberated from prison and expected in this country in May. He had declared in an article which had appeared in 1912, just prior to the Master's arrival in America, that Abdu'l-Bahā's teachings would encourage world peace. And so Abdu'l-Bahá met him while in Washington, D.C. He was also invited to the White House by President Taft at a time when the country was preparing for a federal election. But a last-minute invitation to him from the House Speaker to address U.S. Congress on the 29th of April was graciously declined, as he was traveling to Chicago by train that same evening. He had been invited to speak at the 4th annual NAACP conference and once again urged the theme of race amity to an audience of several thousand, getting wide press coverage. Abdu'l-Bahā's historic trip to the West was focused on the oneness of mankind and the urgency of racial equality. A few years after his American voyage, Abdu'l-Bahá said of the issue of racism, "If the races do not come to an agreement, there can be no question or doubt of bloodshed. When I was in America, I told the white and colored people that it was incumbent upon them to be united, or else there would be the shedding of blood. I did not say more than this, that they might not be saddened, but indeed there is a greater danger than only the shedding of blood. It is the destruction of America. Because aside from the racial prejudice, there is another agitating factor. It is that of America's enemies. These enemies are agitating both sides. That is, they are stirring up the white race against the colored race, and the colored race against the white race. But of this the Americans are submerged in the sea of ignorance. Two other extraordinary events in the course of the Master's visit in America proved in the long term to be of global significance. One occurred on May the 1st while he was in Chicago, where he also attended the last session of the newly founded Baha'i Temple Unity. The second took place about 6 weeks later in New York. May the 1st was a very special day for the American Baha'is. They had been preparing for it for a long time. Land had been purchased on the shores of Lake Michigan, and a large tent had been raised in anticipation of the Master's visit. It was here, during the course of a historic ceremony, that Abdu'l-Baha laid the foundation stone of the Mother Temple of the West at Wilmette. After inspecting the grounds and speaking to the gathering of friends, a small ceremonial golden trowel was handed to the Master. But it proved insufficient and impractical in his opinion. The Master insisted on digging a real hole, so a shovel was brought instead, and he invited the delegates of various American communities to follow his example and dig. Finally, a large rock, contributed by Mrs. Nettie Tobin, was placed as a foundation stone in the hole they had dug together. Afterwards, as the Master packed the earth around it, on behalf of all the people of the world, he joyously declared, "The temple is already built." This building, which Abdu'l-Baha had envisioned as the silent teacher, and which was designed by the French-Canadian architect Louis Bourgeois, became an inspiration for the Baha'is around the world. The design was completed in 1920 before the Master's passing.
The second significant event, unlike the laying of the cornerstone in Chicago, had not been anticipated by the Baha'is in the States. No one was prepared for it. But what occurred on June the 19th, 1912, proved to be a historic day, not only for New York, but for the worldwide Baha'i community. The artist, Juliet Thompson, had been called to work on his portrait on that day. She was given 3 sittings by the Master. I had just begun to work, Lua Getzinger in the room, sitting on a couch nearby, when the Master smiled at me, then, turning to Lua, said in Persian, "I appoint you, Lua, the herald of the covenant, and I am the covenant appointed by Bahá'u'lláh. Go forth and proclaim, this is the covenant of God in your midst." So it was that Abdu'l-Baha named New York the City of the Covenant that day. He also spoke to the friends of the Tablet of the Branch revealed by Bahá'u'lláh in Adrianople, and proclaimed his own station as the centre of the covenant. 80 years later, in 1992, the Second Baha'i World Congress was celebrated in the City of the Covenant, and the visit of the Master was commemorated there.
ای حضرت عبدالبها، ای بانی بیت خدا، ای مرکز عهد بها، دستم بگیر
Another important event took place in August 1912, which has inspired Baha'is all over the world ever since. It was the week that Abdu'l-Baha spent in Eliot, Maine, This idyllic spot was owned by Sarah Farmer, whose family were transcendentalists and associated with the abolitionists and other progressive movements of the times. She had conceived this as a place where minds, souls and bodies could be refreshed. Following the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, 1893, she had had the idea of launching a place for the comparative study of religions, and had formally opened Greenacre in 1894 by raising the world's first peace flag here. Miss Farmer had travelled to Acre to meet Abdu'l-Bahá in 1899 and had been so inspired that on her return she pursued her dream with renewed vigour. Thus it was that the first Bahá'í summer school was instituted in Greenacre in 1900, an event which would be mirrored and multiplied all over the world in the decades that followed. Many influential writers, inventors and thinkers were drawn to Greenacre in those early years, including John Greenleaf Whittier and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Mirza Abul Fazl was one of the first Baha'is to offer lectures on the faith there in the early 1900s. The Master saw Greenacre as a future institution of spiritual and material learning. Many gathered at the 50-room inn overlooking the river to hear him speak and to pay special tribute to Sarah Farmer for her achievements and vision. Another significant episode in the course of Abdu'l-Bahā's visit took place on the West Coast, and this event too proved of profound importance for humanity. Dr. David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford University, was one of the original trustees of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and invited Abdu'l-Bahá to give a special address at the college on the 8th of October. A crowded assembly hall awaited with eager expectation his appearance that day. It was as though Abdu'l-Bahá had his finger on the pulse of his listeners. He set out to establish a scientific foundation for peace for this educated audience, using the atomic model in physics for his argument. From the fellowship and commingling of the elemental atoms, life results. In their harmony and blending, there is ever newness of existence. It is radiance, completeness, it is consummation, it is life itself. If the animals are savage and ferocious, it is simply a means for their subsistence and preservation. They are deprived of that degree of intellect which can reason and discriminate between right and wrong, justice and injustice. On the other hand, humankind possessed a unique capacity for abstract thought. When man is ferocious and cruel toward his fellow man, it is not for subsistence or safety. His motive is selfish advancement and willful wrong. From every real standpoint, there must and should be peace among all nations, he urged, and then attacked the delusions that led to war and the tyrants who promoted these. Torrents of precious blood are spilled in defense of these imaginary divisions, he said, under the delusion of a fancied and limited patriotism. These boundary lines and artificial barriers have been created by despots and conquerors who sought to attain dominion over mankind, thereby engendering patriotic feeling and rousing selfish devotion to merely local standards of government. As a rule, they themselves enjoyed luxuries in palaces surrounded by conditions of ease and affluence, while armies of soldiers, civilians, and tillers of the soil fought and died at their command upon the field of battle, shedding their innocent blood for a delusion such as, "We are Germans, our enemies are French," etc., when in reality all are humankind, all belong to the one family and posterity of Adam. We live upon this earth for a few days, and then rest beneath it forever, Abdu'l-Baha declared, his voice rising to a climax. Shall man fight for the tomb which devours him? What ignorance could be greater than this? To fight over his grave? To kill another for his grave? What heedlessness! What a delusion! As Abdu'l-Baha's piercing gaze swept over the young men in the assembly hall, could he see how many of them would soon sink in the muddy fields of World War I? How many would die under a hail of bullets and in clouds of poison gas? It is my hope, he concluded, that you who are students in this university may never be called upon to fight for the dust of earth which is the tomb and sepulchre of all mankind. The audience was overcome with emotion, and applause shook the building to its very foundation, according to Mahmud, who recorded the event in his diary. When the master left the hall accompanied by his interpreters, many stood by in awe, shaken by what they had just heard and witnessed. His predictions of the Great War were so ominous that one newspaper article referred to Abdu'l-Baha as having claimed that we are on the eve of the Battle of Armageddon, referred to in the 16th chapter of Revelation. The time is 2 years hence, when only a small spark will set aflame the whole of Europe. President Jordan had invited him to lunch at his own home after the talk, and was later asked for his impressions of Abdu'l-Baha. He will surely unite the East and the West, for he walks the mystical way with practical feet, he replied. The Palo Alto newspaper concluded, those who pray for the coming of the kingdom of God on earth may see in Abbas Effendi one who dwells in that kingdom consciously and creates an environment pulsating with the peace that passeth ordinary understanding. His last stop before the long journey back across the United States was a talk in Sacramento, where he again warned his audience of the inevitability of war, though he also affirmed, "May the first flag of international peace be raised in this state." By a strange twist of divine irony, it was indeed in San Francisco in 1945 that the United Nations Charter was signed, and the flag of this international body was first hoisted.
Abdu'l-Baha's journeys in the United States and Canada drew massive media attention. He was in the headlines from the first day he arrived and virtually every time he spoke and everywhere he visited. And in this regard too, his words about the press reverberate down the decades to us today with a particular significance. Abdu'l-Baha expressed himself candidly on the subject. Newspapers are the mirrors that reflect the progression of the community, he said. We may ascertain the progress or retrogression of a nation by its journalism. If journalists should abide by their duties, they would be the promoters of many virtues among the community. But his praise was tempered with caution. Journalists must serve the truth, he said. Newspapers must publish significant articles that shall foster the public welfare. If they do so, they will be the highest promoters for the development of the community. His visit to Montreal was particularly well covered by the Canadian press. 34 articles were published in 10 of the 12 daily newspapers during his brief stay. Abdu'l-Baha's keen insight into contemporary issues captured the headlines. He repeatedly urged that the material achievements of the West should be balanced by spiritual advancement for true civilization to be attained. Otherwise, it would lead to destruction. He was acutely concerned about the Balkans and predicted that a regional war there could envelop the world and lead to large-scale destruction. He addressed many of the other topics of the day when he was interviewed. He said workers should not only receive their wages but a share of the profits as well, to create a just distribution of wealth. He urged capitalists to be moderate and to bear in mind the welfare of the poor and needy. If a part suffered, it would be detrimental to the whole. Thus, legislation was needed to prevent abuse. However, on the subject of equal pay, the master stated that wages would invariably have to be unequal, simply because people were not of equal ability and should be paid according to their varying capacities. One main aim of the master's visit to Montreal was to greet the Baha'i friends and to be with the Maxwell family who lived there. May Bowles had been married to Sutherland Maxwell, a renowned Canadian architect, who insisted the master stay with them during his visit. He did so for 3 days, after which he moved to Hotel Windsor. The master stayed in this room on the upper floor of their home on Pine Avenue. After 23 days in California and a 3-week journey by train across the United States with 5 city stops along the way, Abdu'l-Bahá finally returned to New York on the 11th of November. He was often recognized by passengers because of the widespread publicity generated during his travels. He was approached by many admirers for counsel and friendship. His final talk before he set sail for Liverpool took place on the morning of the 5th of December, when more than 100 people boarded the RMS Celtic to bid him farewell. As Abdu'l-Bahá spoke in his deep, resonant Persian, many wept at his words. The earth is one native land, one home, and all mankind are the children of one Father. God has created them, and they are the recipients of his compassion. It is the wish of our Heavenly Father that we should live together in felicity and joy. The obstacle to human happiness is racial or religious prejudice, the competitive struggle for existence and inhumanity toward each other. Until man reaches this high station, Abdu'l-Bahá said, the world of humanity shall not find rest, and eternal felicity shall not be attained. But if man lives up to these divine commandments, this world of earth shall be transformed into the world of heaven, and this material sphere shall be converted into a paradise of glory. It was finally time to say goodbye and disembark. Abdu'l-Bahá walked out along the deck of the ship. He leaned on the railing and looked down at the crowd gazing up at him. As the clock struck noon, the great ocean liner began to pull slowly away from the pier. But the people fixed their eyes on Abdu'l-Bahá's white turban for as long as it was visible, as the ship set out for the flowing waters of the Hudson and sailed into the open sea. It is more than 2 years that I have been far from the holy shrine of Bahá'u'lláh, the master told the friends while he was in California. Now he was returning home at last, even as the heavy clouds of World War I were gathering.